Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in. I'm Noelle Ellerson AASA's Associate Executive Director for Policy and Advocacy, and you're listening to the PEP Talk podcast, a new way for AASA members to stay engaged with our policy and advocacy work. If it's your first time tuning in, thanks for joining us. Here at PEP Talk, we cover all things that could be remotely labeled as edu-policy. All shows are available for download under the PEP Talk landing page on the AASA website. Looking ahead, if you have a show idea or guest you think we should have on, shoot me a note at nellerson@aasa.org. Our latest episode, which you'll hear next, features Sunil Mansukhani, a principal at the Raven Group, and Philip Tegeler, Executive Director of Poverty and Race Research Action Council, a civil rights policy organization. Sunil Mansukhani has over 2 decades of experience in education and civil rights policy, law, and advocacy from both the nonprofit sector and government. He is a principal at the Raven Group, a Washington, D.C.-based public affairs firm, where he co-leads the education practice. I've worked with Sunil on a host of issues over the years, and most recently we've been collaborating on a seemingly arcane provision in federal law, a relic of anti-busing policy, and a policy that exists today merely because it hasn't been replaced. Philip Tegeler is the Executive Director of Poverty and Race Research Action Council, a civil rights policy organization based in D.C. In 2009, PRRAC helped to found the National Coalition on School Diversity. Philip has written extensively on the application of civil rights law to federal housing and education policy, making him an especially valuable guest for today's episode. Sunil and Philip are going to walk us through what this issue is, what it means to schools, the very fascinating reality behind how and why it persists, and what it is about now that makes it possible to finally make inroads on this policy issue. So Sunil, can you give us the elevator speech on this issue? What is it?
Sure. Well, thank you, Noelle and AASA, for inviting us to be on this podcast. This really is an important issue, and we're so glad that AASA is calling attention to it. It actually goes back to the 1970s, where there's been provisions in federal law that prohibit states or school districts from using federal money for busing for school integration purposes. So if a school district wants to voluntarily take steps to get greater racial diversity among their schools, they cannot use federal money to pay for the transportation that would in all likelihood be needed to make that happen.
Great. And I just can't help but think about how relevant this conversation is when we think about just how busing has worked itself into the political presidential debates, but we're not going directly to that lane right now. So what I'd like you to do is beyond just framing the elevator speech issue, Sunil, AASA has really appreciated the work of your group and coalition on this topic, and it's actually been a multi-part solution. Fill our listeners in on the progress already made and the work that remains to be done.
Sure. Well, what makes this interesting and actually complicated is that there are actually several different places in federal law that contain these anti-busing provisions. So in order to provide school districts with the flexibility to use federal funds to support diversity, each of these provisions need to be removed. And so we started a couple years ago by pointing out to Congress that 2 of the provisions were contained in federal appropriations laws. And those appropriations laws, that's the process that the government used to allocate funding to different federal agencies. Now, as you know, on a conceptual level, both parties would agree that the appropriations process should not be used to make policy. But that's precisely what's been done for over 40 years with respect to these provisions. So they were reauthorized year after year in appropriations laws, and no one said anything about it. And when we raised the issue to Congress, just to give an example, one staffer said back to me that these provisions were like barnacles in the appropriations bills. Since they had been there so long, it was going to be really, really hard to remove them. And so, we persisted. And when our coalition called attention to these provisions and why are they still there, in this day and age, no one had a good answer for why they were still there. They are certainly vestiges of a bygone era. Now, it took us a couple of years to get it done, but Congress finally removed these provisions this last fiscal year 2019, when they went ahead and approved the budget for the United States Department of Education. It was certainly the right thing to do, but it was also a victory for local control and autonomy because it removed a federal bar to how school districts can use federal funds. But as I mentioned at the outset, this type of provision, these anti-busing provisions, were in different places in federal law. So just because we were able to get it removed from the budget process is not the end of the story. There's a similar provision in the General Education's Provisions Act, which I know is sort of a long title, but it's basically the law that governs the Department of Education. And that law, too, has had a long-standing provision going back to the 1970s that prohibits federal money from being used for transportation in support of racial integration. So that's where we are now. We're looking to remove that provision under GEPA, as it's known. So these burdensome restrictions on federal funds can be removed once and for all.
Okay, so when you start to lay it out like that, I think it starts to become more obvious to our members about why we would engage, because there's an element to this conversation that is clearly arcane federal policy that is bad and flawed, but we can't remove it simply because it's been there for so long. And it was really a little bit of a head scratcher when we first started getting involved. So related to that, something that's really resonated with me about this effort, and you started to hint at this in your previous response, is the apparent disconnect between how easy and obvious the fix seems, yet how much effort it has taken. I remember Hill Snap hiding behind claims of it being too interwoven across policies to be worthwhile, which is frustrating when you hear them also say they want to fix it. So break it down for us. In the last 3 to 4 years, what were the obstacles? What was the resistance? And what finally gave way to make momentum turn into action?
Well, Noelle, as you know, turning good public policy into law in Washington is not an easy task, regardless of the merits of the issue or the politics behind it. I mean, you just think about it. The process is set up in a way that puts up many roadblocks to any piece of legislation becoming law. You could think about it whether it's the process by which bills move through the committee, or even just getting floor time in the House or Senate for a vote by the entire body. So that's one issue, is just the way the structure of government is. The second issue, I think, is just the problem of overcoming inertia. Because in many instances, it's easier just to ride out the status quo rather than doing something affirmative. And the affirmative thing in this case is actually removing provisions in federal law. And overcoming inertia is difficult to do both in Congress, and it's also, difficult to do in life. So just to give you an example from the real world, I mean, we all know it's good to exercise and important for us, but it's certainly much easier to remain sitting on the couch and watching TV rather than taking the affirmative step and going out to the gym. And so I would say the same is true here. As I mentioned, these provisions were in federal law for a really long time. And so one of the other questions we received in response to our request to remove these provisions was, why now? These provisions have been around for decades, so why do we need to address them now? Another question we had was that no one knew what the unintended consequences would be of removing these provisions. So they asked us, what could be the unintended consequences of removing these provisions? And, my answer was that, look, the same could be said of any piece of legislation. We just don't know what the unintended consequences could be, but literally anything that was in our minds as possibilities just did not seem to be problematic at all. And so neither we nor anyone else was able to come up with a credible scenario about how removing these provisions would lead to a problematic outcome. And so we kept plugging away at it. I don't think there was any single aha moment that made any difference for us, but rather is continuing to ask questions of those in power about why this federal law is still in place when you could remove it at no cost to the federal government. We often hear in Congress that, no, we can't do X or Y because it'll cost so much. Well, here the cost of doing it is zero, and so that argument went away too. And we also noted that removing this provision would be in keeping with the spirit of the Every Student Succeeds Act, which is the main federal law governing education and was passed in 2015. That act, as I think many of your members know, sought to provide greater state and local control. And certainly by removing these anti-busing provisions, Congress would be providing school districts with greater flexibility on how they could use federal funds, which is something I think that we all agree on in this instance.
We structured these questions this way to really warm up our listeners to what is a complex issue, even though it's so seemingly obvious. So we started with the elevator speech. We went to a little bit of a dissection of the multi-part solution, and then we got into the really tangly part of how something so obvious could seem so complicated. And this is where we want to really start asking Philip some questions. So Philip, having set the stage for all the drama and action here on Capitol Hill, I think it's actually even more helpful to have an understanding of the research behind it. So much like the policy, I guess the research has evolved. What do our listeners need to know?
Thanks, Noelle. I think when we're talking about research on school integration policy, I'm really thinking about three kinds of research that fed into our work on this bill and this advocacy campaign. The first is the historical research. Where did these provisions come from? What was the historical setting at the time? And as came out in the presidential debate recently, this came out of a period when so-called forced busing, federally mandated busing in response to findings of intentional school segregation were taking place all around the country. Boston was one of the big flashpoints for this controversy, also Los Angeles, and Wilmington, Delaware, where Senator Biden was elected senator. And it was the idea that there would be the use of federal funds to pay for the use of school buses to bring kids across segregated neighborhoods to go to each other's schools. That was, viewed as a problem by people who were opposed to busing remedies at that time. And this provision that we're trying to eliminate now was one of a whole series of anti-busing amendments that were being passed or proposed during that time period in the 70s. And for some reason, this one was passed and has never been removed. We're obviously at a very different historical place now, where much of the action in school integration is locally grown, either at the state or local level, where people are stepping up and doing voluntary plans, and they need to use federal money for school buses. A very different setting now, but it's important to understand that history. The second kind of research is the general research on the benefits of school integration. When we talk about school integration today, we're talking about both racial and economic integration. We have a pattern in this country since the height of court-ordered school integration, where we've seen schools get more and more segregated in this country, to the point now where we're as segregated as we were at the start of the whole school integration movement in the late 60s, early 70s. And that's a kind of double segregation we're facing now by both race and poverty. We have a policy in many states, unspoken policy perhaps, where many low-income kids of color are being educated in separate schools. And today that's really one of the major educational problems we face, is this idea of separate and unequal schools for low-income kids. The research that has come out on the benefits of integration in the last 20 years is just stronger and stronger every year. And, I don't have time to go into the vast research on the benefits of integration, but, we know finally today that kids who attend integrated schools, both racially and economically integrated schools, have higher achievement in math, science, language, and reading, better long-term outcomes in terms of high school graduation, college attendance. They tend to have more qualified teachers, better school climate, and probably most importantly, there's an increase that's been documented in cross-racial trust and friendships, a breakdown in the perpetuation of prejudice, stereotypes, and fears of people from other racial groups. These are some of the most important benefits of all for a country that's becoming more and more polarized. A lot of the research I'm describing is collected on the National Coalition on School Diversity website. That's www.school-diversity.org. If you look under research briefs, you'll see several that summarize the latest research and findings on school integration. The other thing I want to mention really is the research on transportation, which is at the heart of this law. There's been a lot of analysis done of different kinds of school choice plans, including plans that involve magnet schools and other types of integration programs. The fact is, school choice programs that don't really have an integration plan or component in them have a tendency to make things more segregated, because the kids who really need to have choice and take advantage of choice to attend higher performing, less segregated schools often do not have transportation available to them. So if you take transportation off the table and don't provide funding for it for the purposes of integration, you end up having school choice systems that make things worse. Transportation is a key part of integration in any effective integration plan.
Okay, so when you tee it up like that, I actually have a couple of questions that jump to mind. So there's the next one in the script that we talked about ahead of time, but I want to deviate from that a little bit. So I want to touch on the prevalence of school busing and integration in headlines lately, and this is spurred by recent debates with the presidential candidates. Can you help our listeners understand how that issue is both separate from, but also related to, the specifics of what we're talking about today? And I don't know if that's a Sunil or a Philip question. And then as you think about that answer, my next question after that is about implementation for schools when there's a fix. So we'll parse out between the two of that. But if you could help our members and listeners understand where the overlap exists between this advocacy issue that we're engaged on and the version of this headline that's playing out right now.
The headlines that are playing out right now are in part the relitigating controversies that took place decades ago. Senator Harris made a point of saying that, it was important for the federal courts to intervene to address school segregation in the 60s and 70s and 80s, because that was a way of achieving equal educational opportunity. And we had a policy in many parts of this country of separating kids by race, and that needed to be addressed. And school busing was only one of the techniques used to help address segregation. When you look at the field today, we have school busing taking place in a wide variety of contexts. More than 90% of school busing in the country has nothing to do with integration per se. It's just buses taking kids to school. Almost every school district uses busing, except the very small ones. Of the districts that are using school buses to help to promote racial and economic integration, there are still some districts that are operating under desegregation orders, especially in the South. And the ones that are still in operation are doing a good job in helping promote academic achievement, cross-racial understanding, and integration. And I think a lot of those plans have a lot of support in their local communities. So you could say that there's still some court-ordered busing out there, but it's not really particularly controversial anymore where it exists. And then you have a lot of places that are doing it voluntarily, that they're saying, we need to come up with ways of getting out of this pattern of segregated neighborhoods and segregated schools. We have to develop our school attendance zones and our transportation patterns in a way that brings kids together across racial and class lines. And that's becoming increasingly prevalent. And the issue here is, where's the funding to do that? Obviously, most transportation funding is from local sources. Cities and school districts that are getting federal funds because they have a high poverty population should also have the option of using some of those funds to transport students. And that's what this bill is about. And that's what this provision in the general education laws prohibits across the board. It doesn't say we're only going to prohibit court-ordered busing for integration. It says we're going to prohibit any use of federal funds for student transportation for integration, whether it's voluntary or not. I hope that provides a little more context on where this fits in the overall, student transportation universe.
It does. It absolutely does. And that's why I asked that question. And it's helpful. We want our listeners to understand where what we talk about on the podcast may overlap with current headlines. So this isn't a podcast that's done every week or every day and is trying to be current on events. It just so happens that we tease this up, and then the presidential debate lends itself to a little bit of overlap. But the big question I always wanted to ask is, so what does this mean for superintendents going forward? For a listener tuning in right now, what are the examples that can help bring this life? I know that you, Philip, been advocating on this for a while. Can you share the specifics of a few direct examples of this in schools and communities? And as a tangent to that, what are some of the takeaways, the obstacles and opportunities to really getting this to work outside of the obvious one of the prohibition on federal funding?
I think from a superintendent's perspective, if you're lucky enough to be the superintendent of a district that has true racial integration on a residential basis, you don't really have to worry too much. Most of our, metro areas, especially in the East Coast and Midwest, are extremely segregated residentially, and it's difficult to have integrated schools without some kind of student transportation. And, I think that educational professionals recognize this, and it's really just a question of oftentimes political will. Is your community ready to step up and do what it takes to promote school integration? What kind of techniques are you going to use? And no matter what you do, I think student transportation has got to be part of the solution. I'm very familiar with, I've been to a lot of places that have good school integration programs up and running. I'm most familiar with the Hartford region up in Connecticut, where there is a two-way school integration project going between the city of Hartford and about 30 suburban school districts. It's a two-way system. You have children from Hartford, which is about a 95% African American and Latino student population. You have those kids who are several thousand every year taking buses out to predominantly white, low poverty suburban school districts. And you have kids from the suburbs taking buses in to the city and the first ring suburbs to a series of 40 magnet schools, which are set up to basically address the high rates of racial and economic segregation in the Hartford schools. So you have kids from Hartford going to school side by side with kids from the suburbs, and it's supported by a regional student transportation system. It's a key part of that remedy to have that taking place, and it's really a beautiful system they have in place. They've a lot of growing pains as in any of these programs, but it's quite impressive to see. And it's also, for me, I'm particularly interested to see how many suburban middle class and white families sign up for the magnet schools every year. And there's this waiting list of suburban kids. It's not easy to get into these schools, but you have kids basically taking bus rides from suburban school districts into the magnet schools, where they're essentially a minority of kids in the school. Maybe you have a school that's 25 or 30% white enrollment, but it's seen regionally as a very high performing school, often with a specialized theme that attracts kids from all over the region. And similarly, with the other side of the two-way program, where kids are taking buses out to the suburban district from Hartford, some of those suburban districts are doing a really great job in including these kids as part of their community and taking ownership of these kids all the way from kindergarten through high school graduation. Once you're a first grader who goes out to a suburban district from Hartford, that suburban district is your district, and you are allowed to stay there through high school. And that obviously, for a lot of these kids, there's not a reliable source of transportation in their families. There's not reliable access to a car. Many families in Hartford don't even have a car. So you absolutely need the student transportation to make a program like that work.
So I just listened to that, and I'm not an administrator. I'm thinking about our members, and those that work is intense and those conversations are intense. But when I think about what we focus on at AASA and what this podcast focuses on, it's the policy fix. So to date, really, when we think about AASA's engagement around this issue, it's really been mostly handled at a staff level. So I'd be interested in both you, Philip, and Sunil, talking to, is it worthwhile for superintendents and education leaders and anyone interested in ensuring that districts and states, when they want to, can use federal dollars to help address integration? Is it worth them talking with their member of Congress about this? I mean, we talked about how it's a barnacle of an issue so woven into appropriation. Is it something where constituent advocacy makes a difference?
Sure, absolutely. I think that will be the case in any policy question. Congressmen want to know, what do my constituents think about this? And, if I'm not hearing anything about it, and, Noelle is as influential as you are, if it's just a trade association asking for a change, I think it makes it so much more effective if people from the trade association, the members themselves, the ones who are affected, are the ones coming along and saying, yeah, we need that change. And I think for your membership, it really does boil down to flexibility. This school integration is one of the few strategies that have been found to decrease the black-white achievement gap. Over the years, the government has tried numerous sorts of strategies, everything from reducing class sizes to a whole range of other steps. But at the end of the day, there's very few that actually work, and school integration is one of them. So much so, in fact, that New York State, when they were doing their AASA plan, as it's known, when they were talking about, how are we going to improve our schools, the ones that are not doing that well, our Title I schools that are not performing well, one of the items that they specifically put in there was racial integration as a school improvement strategy. And so they certainly recognize the importance of it. And so what we are hoping for is that by removing this provision, it will take the weight off, if you will, of superintendents who might be wanting to do something in this area but don't quite know what steps to take or are afraid of what obstacles there might be. And so our job at this moment is to at least remove one of those obstacles while at the same time calling attention to the larger issue so that people know just what a difference a really good integration plan could do for student achievement.
So as you just gave that answer, I totally started picturing in my mind, isn't there a nursery rhyme or a folk tale of the little boy who cried wolf, right? And he's like putting his finger in the dam to plug the hole. I mean, this is one seemingly small fix, but it could open up a possibility of flexibility to really make some meaningful change as it relates to being able to use federal dollars to support busing to ultimately address integration. Is that a proper way to kind of capture what a small change could result in?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I want to emphasize one thing, and that is this is all voluntary. No one's forcing a school district to do anything. So if in the superintendent and school board's best judgment that some sort of integration plan could actually make a difference, and there's plenty of research, as Phil has indicated, to support that, they should have the support of the federal government, among others, to do that. And so, that's what we're trying to do here, is to change the federal government from an obstacle to a supporter.
So that actually warrants a further clarification. To the extent that there is continued resistance at the federal level, is there anyone on Capitol Hill who's saying that they don't think that states and locals should be able to use the federal dollars? Or is it purely that it's just a barnacle, or it's a far-reaching policy that has tentacles that are just hard to unlatch? I mean, is there substantive opposition to the idea of federal dollars being used for busing?
If there is opposition, we haven't heard it. And, we have made every effort to speak to both sides of the aisle, as well as to the folks on the committees who are most involved in this. And we certainly haven't heard that as being a stated reason for keeping this in there.
Great. That's exactly the answer I wanted to hear. So thanks, Sunil. I like when people tell me what I want to hear. But that's also very, very helpful, right? That's very helpful to our listeners and to school administrators and other school leaders and school community stakeholders who want to think about a different way to take a bite at this apple. And it could be that now maybe there's a lane or an avenue in which they can engage with a specific ask that feels manageable, that is accomplishable, that can have meaningful impact. So I've reached the end of the questions that I have, both scripted and unscripted. Thank you both, Philip and Sunil, for your patience with my unscripted questions. But is there anything else we need to talk about? Do you have anything else you want to add to our dialogue today for the listeners to hear before we wrap up?
Well, I would say that if superintendents are using this opportunity to reach out to their elected representatives on the issue of school integration and how important it is to them professionally, it would also be good to mention the Strength and Diversity Act.
Oh, okay.
Which is a bill that's pending right now to fund a competitive grants program for school district planning to promote school integration. It would be a program which would be available to your members if it passed Congress. Now, it's less likely to pass in this Congress as a bipartisan bill, but it's worth mentioning when folks go to speak to their representatives. It's kind of a package, both bills. And Sunil can fill you in a little more on that if that would be helpful. But as long as you're calling, I think it's good to raise both issues.
You know what might be most advantageous, actually, when we publish this podcast, Sunil and Philip, maybe I'll coordinate with you offline, and we can get a quick little blog post to talk about the specific legislation where we could include both the asks for that bill, but also this specific fix. That way they have the 1-2 punch of listening to this episode, but also seeing in front of them what the background is and what the advocacy ask would be.
That would be terrific. And, just to close on my end for your audience, as Phil has indicated, there are numerous successful examples of school districts successfully trying to promote diversity. And so for those of you listening out there who want to know how to get started, you're not starting from scratch. And certainly the legislation Phil just mentioned would help in terms of funding and providing additional models, but some of those models are there today. For those of you who are interested in learning more just about the state of integration today, the National Coalition on School Diversity has just in the last few weeks published a state of integration report that is on the National Coalition on School Diversity's website, which I urge all of you to take a look at, and that'll tell you where we are, both challenges and opportunities today. And, you need to know where we are today in order to move forward.
Philip and Sunil, thank you for taking the time to be with us today and for those closing comments. We are just about out of time, but here at AASA, we're thankful to know and work with you and to have you among our allies and pushing for this obvious policy win. Thank you for being with us today, taking the time to share your expertise and insights, and helping our listeners understand exactly what this policy is, to break down why it continues to persist, and to paint such a clear pathway towards a better, more equitable solution that empowers state and local leadership on the important issue of integration. To our listeners, thanks for tuning in. We hope you found this conversation helpful and worth your time. We look forward to chatting with you in the future. Philip and Sunil, thank you, and that concludes today's episode.